I'm also really interested in the social aspects of APIs. So today is not going to be a technical talk whatsoever. I have no code on my slides. It's all about openness and why that matters for your organization and for your API, what that means, how that affects your business, and how that affects the way that you think about and design all these things. So in order to talk about like what is open, we have to talk about like what is open, right? So you can't just say like open APIs and start talking about them. We need a notion of openness in the first place. So when I was thinking about this problem, like what really does define an open API? Because in a certain sense, all APIs are about opening yourself up to other people, right? So like what does an open API specifically mean? Well, I decided to look at the actual logo for the open source initiative as my first thing. I was like, let's go to the root, right? Open source is sort of the avenue which I approach open APIs. But since you're not sharing source code, the definition has to be a little bit different. But when I was looking at the logo, I thought, wow, this logo is perfect. I've seen this before. Have you guys seen this before? This is the Open Source Initiative's logo. And so what's really interesting about this logo, when you look at it visually, is that you have sort of this keyhole, right? And this keyhole is opening up the space from the outside into the center or the inside, right? Which is like a really fantastic visual representation. I've never really thought about it before. I was like, oh yeah, that's just some logo that they came up with. But I thought this was actually really smart. And this is sort of like the core of why open APIs are open APIs too. It's not just open source, right? We have this sort of this inside core that we're sharing with the outside world in a very like transparent way. Programmers specifically love biological metaphors, and in the business world we also use biological metaphors. So in order to talk about the way that openness affects your organization and therefore your APIs, first I want to explore this idea through a biological metaphor of your company as an organism. So this is a little bit better when it might be a little blurry towards the back, but when you think about an organism, you think about this whole that is connected with tons of little parts, right? So this is sort of a picture, a representation of what that might be. But then at the level of those individual parts, we have cells, right? So an organism is made up of organs which are made up of these cells. And now these cells have, a nucleus, and they have the outside and all this inner stuff. When I was looking at this diagram, I was like, man, 7th grade biology, like, wasn't that awesome? I don't remember what half these words are, but I do remember reading about them at some point, right? So like, yeah, proteins and, cell membranes and all that stuff, like, it makes me want to go back and read that stuff again. But I think that this diagram is really interesting when you think about both APIs and organizations. So we have all this stuff inside of this cell membrane wrapper. So in a business context, of course, because I'm a developer, I make engineering the big one in the middle, right? But it doesn't really matter. We have all these different departments that compose the organism of your company or what you're trying to build, right? So and they sort of are guarded off, and we give them these individualized names, right? So you have engineering, you have IT, you have HR, maybe sales, marketing, product, which didn't fit, so I just split it up on 2 lines. But they're all sort of these like self-closed little entities, right? And people tend to specialize in one of these things. If you ask someone in your organization what they do, they won't say something like, well, I dabble in this area and I do this other thing, right? We're sort of like, oh, I'm an engineer, I'm in HR, I'm in marketing. And if they do dabble in multiple areas, they still will tend to tell you like, yeah, I'm an engineer, but I also do a little sales sometime. And they still define themselves in terms of where they fit inside of these silos. And all these different organs work together inside of the organism. So this sort of like cellular mechanism sort of works its way both up and down, right? On an individual level as well as at a macro level. So all the individuals in your engineering team would also form these individual bits that work together to form the organization that is your engineering team, right? So this sort of works at all different levels of abstraction in the stack. Also works in the technical side too. So if you've ever seen engineers diagram the way that their systems work, they say, oh, well, here's our web servers that are behind these caches, and then here's our database. And there'd probably be a little more lines, but it's sort of the same kind of diagram, right? So, oh, well, I'm a database engineer, right? Like I'm a back-end engineer, I'm a front-end engineer. And we sort of define ourselves in these little like silos, and we compose those individual parts together to make a particular organization. So let's talk about the internet, right? So if we can define the way that our companies works in this way and the way that our teams work in this way, what about the internet itself, right? Like as a biological metaphor. So this definitely looks like the internet, right? Like there's tons of computers that are super interconnected together to form this gigantic mass. And I'm not sure that the cellular level, like inside of a computer, necessarily works as an organism, but you can sort of see how this would be this way, right? Like the nucleus would be the CPU, and you'd have all these connected subsystems that, the buses sort of work like your nerve endings between components. So I think that's a pretty reasonable way. But on a more macro level, the same like diagram works for all the individual companies that are on the internet, right? All the different servers or services. So, you have Google obviously big and in the center, right? Maybe Microsoft if you're on that team, but I'm also not on Team Google, but I'm more on Team Google than on Team Microsoft. And, maybe Salesforce and Facebook, and we have all these little federated, services that all work together as being part of the internet, right? You can't point at one particular thing and say, like, that's the internet. It's a whole that's made up of all these different parts. And whenever you're creating your service, you want to like inject yourself into that internet, right? You come online, you become part of this community of people who are all interacting in this way. What's funny is when you think about this as biological metaphor, when you talk about inserting yourself into the cell, that and you end up on the inside, that's the same process that viruses use, right? So you're like injecting yourself into the organism with the intention of replicating and spreading yourself to control more and more of it until you kill it eventually. That's why I'm not on Team Google. Anyway, so biology. I think that this is a useful metaphor, and it served us well for a long time, but there's some problems with it, and it comes down to this sense of openness and why this biological metaphor doesn't always work. So I want to talk about assemblages, which are, as a word, you can just sort of pretend it's a black box, as this concept that replaces the idea of cells when describing organizations. So these two diagrams, right, they're like almost the same thing, trying to get across these parts that are part of a whole. But, if we think about it, the body, a body is made up of all these individual organs, and the body itself sort of forms this totality of who we are. It's the sum of all of our parts, right? And if you think about the body as being this sort of total thing, if you remove someone's heart, they die, right? Well, like it used to be that way, but now we can do heart transplants. So it doesn't really make sense to think about the body as being comprised of these individual parts anymore, like it used to. But now that we have advanced medicine, we're past that point. So like my grandfather, for example, has had 2 of his hips replaced, one of his knees, and he's going to get a shoulder done soon. And I'm like, at what point are you a robot, Grandpa, right? Like Ghost in the Shell is my favorite anime, and a lot of the people in that have had essentially their entire bodies replaced except for their brains, right? And so one of the fundamental questions that particular series asks is, like, at what point do we stop being human? Like, how much of the body is actually needed for you to be considered still human, right? So this is sort of where I think this idea of that we've moved past the point now where the biological metaphor for organizations doesn't really make sense anymore. And that's because of APIs, specifically. So this diagram represents this totality, right? We have our whole organization is in this diagram. Our whole body is in this diagram. And these are all the organs that represent our body. These are all the pieces that represent our organization. And so these lines designate like territory, right? Like everything inside the line is inside my company, and everything outside the line is outside my company. So what about this, right? This is specifically breaking the line in that territory, right? We're opening up our internals to the outside world, sort of deterritorializing the organization overall. So that's why I think this is like such an amazing like visual when I think about it, is that it's breaking that circle. The circle is not a hole anymore. Like the walls have been breached, if you're a little concerned about this idea of openness. And so like what does this diagram represent, right? We're trying to push ourselves into this overall internet organism. Like what is a body without its organs? How does that work? Like this is why this metaphor totally breaks down. So, and one of the reasons why this breaks down is because when you view things as this totality of components, you miss emergent behaviors, right? So The organismic notion of totality forecloses the possibility of analyzing both the contingent interactions between parts as well as the emergent properties of the whole. Right? So if programmers love abstraction, and we love using abstraction to solve problems because that's our primary tool in our toolbox, right? We black box things and then we ignore what happens below that level of abstraction. But the problem is that when you do that, you lose all of the detail and information about those things. So when we black box, IT, for putting in an organizational standpoint. If you don't know anything, like one of the charges that people in engineering would make about people in management is that they don't know anything about how engineering works, and so they don't have a view of how those components work, right? Well, they're just doing the same things that we do with code, right? They black box it. But that means that you don't have the insight about the inner workings. And if you're on the inside of that like envelope, then you may not know how all these components work together. And once you put a lot of components in one area, there may be emergent properties that you couldn't know about or didn't know about whenever you were putting the organization together itself. So that's the problem with creating these convenient little boxes to place things in, is that you miss these emergent properties and you miss the details at all different levels, which is kind of the idea of black boxing, but may not be always good. So I see the API economy as being an assemblage, not actually as being an organism. And the reason for this is if you think about let's talk about using Google's API, right? Like I want to build something, I want to use one of Google's APIs to do it. So maybe let's say like Google Maps, for example, right? So traditionally, if you would think about like an engineering diagram to determine the relationship between Google and yourself when you build on Google's API, is that you would draw this kind of line, right? You're like, oh yeah, we partner with Google, we work with Google. The problem with this style of diagram is that it ignores the fact that you're actually like there's no your thing is this totality around you and Google, but it's not actually this, right? Too, this is also a lie. Your overall product is not encompassing all of Google and all of you. It's actually much more like this, right? So you're sort of mixing, part of your organization relies on Google now, and part of Google's business relies on you. Earlier, we were talking about like Amazon and their affiliate program, right? Like Amazon would not make us nearly as much money if they didn't have all those affiliates selling their stuff. So when you have this API, when you're building stuff on top of APIs, it looks much more like this than it does like this. The borders of your organizations have started crossing over into each other. And so this comes back to this notion of control, right? So the biggest issue with this is control. And this is what I see as one of the big deals about APIs. Some people ask me about like, oh, you're going to talk about openness in this talk. Are you going to be addressing questions about fear, right? And often this fear is about this lack of control. Because people, even though people draw the diagram with the two lines, when the arrow between them, they know instinctively that it's actually like this, right? That Google is gaining a part of your business, or Amazon is gaining a part of your business. And we want to maintain our borders, right? You don't want the castle to be invaded. You want the moat, and you want the walls, and you don't want anybody from outside the system coming inside the system. So fundamentally, this changes the nature of control within organizations. And that's because we've breached the wall of the organization, and that's sort of what APIs do. And you can try to fight it, or you can try to embrace it, basically. So I'm on the side of arguing for embracing this different style of control as opposed to trying to fight it, because you can't simultaneously share something and control it, right? This is like the fundamental lesson of digital rights management, is that it's forever being broken every time you try to do it, because it's impossible to like say, hey, I want to give you these ideas, but by the way, they're still mine. That doesn't really work that way. So this is, in using this particular symbol, this is sort of what happens with these APIs, right? You start getting this interlocked, your openness and my openness come together, and we form this new diagram of control. So it ends up looking like this with these things overlapped. Now, what I would argue is that, like I said, embracing over throwing this away, the companies that you see that are successful now are the ones that embrace this new style of organization and this new style of control between organizations as opposed to throwing it away. And we happen to have a fantastic case study of this going on right now, and that's Twitter, right? So we're like watching Twitter burn before our eyes because they specifically are rejecting this notion of control. So TechCrunch in 2009, isn't the new TechCrunch logo terrible? You can't tell it's TechCrunch at all. in 2009, some people inside of Twitter leaked internal documents of Twitter's to TechCrunch. Or maybe they did it on purpose for marketing, like whatever, But the point is that TechCrunch came into control of some documents. And this is the stuff that they said, right? They're talking about number of users. We want to be the first to 1 billion users. The first to 1 billion is awesome, right? They're always trying to grow grow the pie of people. But these last 2 bullet points were the things that were most interesting, and I remember this stuck out to me whenever I read it the first time. If we had 1 billion users, that would be the pulse of the planet. Are we building a new internet? And I thought at the time, I was like, man, Twitter is so full of themselves. And then, years later, that's like I got rid of my cell phone because I spend too much time tweeting and not enough time talking to people, right? So it's kind of funny that like back then in 2009, this is the way Twitter viewed themselves. The pulse of the planet. Are we building a new internet? They're like becoming part of the fabric of everyday life and playing with everyone. They want everyone in under the Twitter tent because they're trying to communicate in that way, right? They're concerned about the number of users. They want to be broad and spread out to everyone. Now, on the other hand, Twitter has turned in the opposite direction, and we get this diagram, right? Which I don't know if you remember you've seen. This is my sort of snarky interpretation. Twitter released this four-sector diagram of what they wanted people to use their API for. And they said, with our new API guidelines, we're trying to encourage activity in the upper left, and lower right quadrants and limit certain use cases that occupy the upper right quadrant. So what's in the upper right quadrant? Traditional Twitter clients. That's what everyone uses the Twitter API for, right? Like that was the #1 usage of their API previously was the Twitter interface isn't good enough for me. I would like a customized client. That's 99% of my usage of the Twitter API was using Twitter clients, right? And that's what everybody wanted. But that's what Twitter is trying to kill. And the other 3 sectors are social CRM, social analytics, and social influence ranking, which maybe like you guys want in terms of your company, but in terms of normal people, like they don't care about those things whatsoever. So Twitter basically, instead of embracing the fact that people were using their APIs in ways that they didn't want them to use it, they decided to start restricting people using their APIs. They started to introduce all these crazy draconian rules, and it means that people are more and more upset, right? Like every single time one of these stories comes out with Twitter's new API guidelines, there's some post on every single social news site, and everyone is crying out about how Twitter is terrible and they won't want to use it anymore. I myself actually built a federated open source alternative to Twitter in 2 weeks after seeing this, not this one, the one before this, which was their terms of service guideline changes, because all my Ruby friends said, yeah, man, Twitter sucks. If you build an alternative, we'll totally use it. And they did for like a week, and they quit and went back to Twitter. But eventually, like this will catch up to them, right? Like people have learned. The biggest thing about this, and this is sort of what's dangerous, is that you can still say like, oh, well, everyone's still using Twitter, so does this actually matter? The problem is this is encouraging the like no more sharecropping attitude. Like I'm not going to build my stuff on your platform because you can revoke it at any time, right? Like how many people build a business on Twitter and now feel super burned because they were in the upper right-hand quadrant, right? How many people if Twitter likes this stuff today, if you're in the social analytics or social CRM space, that's awesome. But what if Twitter decides that that stuff is actually in the upper right and not in the bottom left anymore? Like they could just change their opinion tomorrow and destroy your business if you're built on top of Twitter. And that's because they've sort of rejected this fact that they're sharing with you. They're not actually being open. They're trying to hold all of the cards. And that's sort of, it's like an API anti-pattern in my experience and understanding is that this idea of open means that you need to understand that people may take your business in new places you didn't intend it to go. I mean, that's the whole point, right? Like if you knew the way it would go, you would just build it yourself. You wouldn't open up an API. One of the great advantages of having an API is the fact that other people will build stuff for you, right? Like what's the point of holding all these hackathons and getting all these people to get interested in building stuff on top of you if you're just going to like turn off their access later and or not use their ideas, right? How many companies did Twitter acquire that were things that were built on top of their API, right? Like their current Mac app was originally Tweety, right? And they bought it. And they made it the official one, and then they abandoned it. But that's like, another story entirely. So anyway, that's the point, I guess, is that Twitter is disrespecting this, and this harms everybody because it means that people aren't willing to be as open anymore because they've been burned once by this kind of thing. So, and Twitter used to be the poster child for the perfect thing to do with an API, right? Like everybody said, like, oh, REST APIs, look at Twitter's. So anyway, that's my why open, and I think I'm over time or am I under time? Sweet. I apparently have a bunch of extra time left over. I'm so used to having my computer in front of me and be able to gauge like how much time I got that I'm totally in the dark. So that's all my slides, but I'd be happy to answer questions. Ken.
Do you see any valid uses of API rate limiting? Twitter has used them, to protect against, outages, scalability
Right.
issues, and then they restrict for, terms of use, business uses. But do you see any valid uses for API rate limiting?
I do think that technical uses, I mean, this is my programmer side showing through. Business uses of rate limiting? No. Technical uses, absolutely, right? But that's because that's my bias. But I think that it's better to say, we're growing so fast that we don't have the capacity to handle your requests, and so that everyone can have access, we're going to rate limit, as opposed to, we want you to pay more money, so we're going to rate limit. And maybe that makes sense, like for your business, but I think that it really comes down to like your thing about stories, right? It's about the story that you give off. So if the story is, it's really, really hard to scale right now, and we're growing like crazy, so we can't afford to give everyone unlimited access. I think that creates a story of like, we're trying to work with you, we're building more stuff, we hope to make it better in the future. Whereas one that's based around like, if it's just, we know that everyone wants the streaming API, so we're going to limit that to only people that pay us 6 figures a year. Creates this story of like, we don't want everyone to use it. We're not totally open. Like it's about money and that kind of thing. So I think it's really in how you pitch it, not so much what it is for specifically. And that's sort of. I think that your talk earlier, stuff about stories is really, really important, right? Like Twitter has lost the narrative of like a great API company, and whether or not they are good or bad, the story is now that Twitter is abusing people's businesses. So like that's what people are going to remember. Yeah, what's up?
So I'm going to come across as an evil capitalist right now.
It happens. I'm used to it.
I'm a big open guy and a big open source guy. But if Twitter is just a big API, right, that people can use their cool third-party clients with,
Uh-huh.
how can they afford to run however many thousands or hundreds of thousands of servers it takes to run Twitter? Because there's no money in that.
I mean, Twitter was making lots of money before they started clamping down on their API, right? Like they had those deals with Google, and they had the deal with Microsoft, and they had all that search stuff, right? Like if Twitter is, back when they used to say like we're the pulse of the planet, they understood that having the pulse of the planet is super valuable, right? Like being able to forecast things of like, oh, hey, this topic is trending in the last 30 minutes, right? Like maybe there's some sort of event that has happened, like all those kinds of things. Are stuff that they did and they stopped doing, or like they could do and move forward. I mean, people are entitled to do whatever they want. It just means that I'm not going to build a business on top of them anymore. So you could argue from that angle too, like it's just that it doesn't make sense as a business. Like, yeah, maybe they think they can monetize that way, but maybe the market will reject that as an idea of monetization. So it's not even necessarily, regardless of my staunchly anti-capitalist views, the market may reject them just as much as like, my ethics or whatever, too. So. Yeah, I don't live in San Francisco for a reason.
So you don't have to make a profit. You sucker everyone into using you, and then you switch model so that you can now make lots of money to pay back the venture capitalists. And there's there seems to be the current trend in new startups.
Yeah.
It's the dot-com boom over again, but that seems to be my feeling is that they kind of went down that line.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely part of it. I mean, also, if you look at Twitter's case specifically, I think that they sort of examined the fact that most people don't tweet and they use it to consume, and they decided to start angling it towards the consumption. But if you alienate the producers, then you don't have anything to consume in the first place. So, I guess we can only speculate because we don't work at Twitter. But, yeah. What's up?
So the whole thing is actually, I think, a pretty good case from a business perspective as to such. Twitter's a pretty good case against hypermedia.
Okay.
If their API were truly open and interoperable, with link relations, etc., some like competitors like app.net or so could easily take over their position, but they can't because Twitter's API is so shitty and complicated. And there's so much tight coupling going on, with all the deprecations and backwards compatibility changes that I have to do. It's like everyone's locked into this, and a competitor could do the same thing, but it would immediately look like they're going to screw over users as well. So they weren't open from the beginning in how their API functions. Mechanically, it's tight coupling, it's RPC and CRUD.
Right.
So even though they label it a REST API,
Sure.
it is.
I forgot to repeat the last question, but I'll repeat this one for the mic for the camera. Is like, so this means would be a business case against hypermedia because if they were more open, other competitors could take over their space. Yeah. So what I guess I will say is that there are tons of people who implement the Twitter API, right? So for example, my project to do open microblogging, we've almost re-implemented the entire Twitter API, because it is just an interface. Even if it is a more complicated one and it's taken a long time to implement it, just because you are crappy and hard to implement does not mean that you are safe from other people re-implementing, right? Like StatusNet has a complete Twitter-compatible API. So I think that can slow people down, which may be useful in a business case, but it's not a solution and it's not going to stop that from happening. So that's sort of what I would argue in that case. Yeah, that's it.
So when it comes to open source code, we have this idea of licenses that get coupled with it, right? And it defines how people can use this code.
Yes.
Redistribute. Do you think there's a place for some sort of licensing within the open API space in terms of setting guidelines for what people can expect?
Sure. So the question is, open source has licenses that ensure a source is open. What about APIs and licensing in terms of keeping stuff open? I think that, so definitely licensing is a hugely important part of open source. I think that essentially the equivalent right now is terms of service. So there's lots of services like TLDR, TOS, which shows this is the terms of service for this API, and here are the pros and cons about how open or not open it is. I definitely think that projects like that are important because nobody wants to read through tons of legalese documents, right? So, and even those of us who like to sometimes don't want to, right? So I read tons of legalese documents for fun sometimes, but I definitely don't read them before I click update on my software, right? Whatever. So I think that's the closest thing that we have currently, and I can't imagine there being something more restrictive. I definitely don't like the idea of using copyright on APIs because I think it introduces a lot of problems, and luckily the Samsung versus Apple thing or Google versus Oracle thing seems to have knocked out that as a possibility. So the only thing I can see, at least in the near future, is that sort of terms of service stuff and making it more transparent about what it is and is that you're not doing in terms of service stuff. So yeah, I think that's probably the closest. Alrighty, well, thanks everybody. Yep.
I just have a question. If you look at your metaphor, what's missing is the evolution stuff, the Darwinism.
Right.
I mean, in your thing, every bubble was the same side.
Sure.
It's never the case.
That's true.
And
So
that's the problem with Twitter. It was smaller, and then it becomes to be bigger, and was looking for money, so try to kill the other.
right. So the interesting thing, since I came in under time, I assumed I didn't have a place to put in my own Darwin stuff like Mike did. One of the interesting things about evolution is that it requires a large population of things in order to select, right? So we imagine that bird, the thing that Mike showed, as being oh, well, it went to this and then this and then this and this. But actually there were 20 or 100 subspecies, one of which had that particular evolution, and then all those other ones died, and that one lived on. And then another generation happened where there were 20 variations, and then all the other ones died except for that one. So I'm talking about these things to business people. I don't like to talk about evolution because in the reality it means that most of your businesses will all die and the good ones will live. People don't like hearing that. And as a former startup founder whose company went under, I don't like hearing that either. But evolution requires a large variance across population to interact, and it's only at the point of that generation swap that you're able to make that distinction, right? So if I don't have children, then evolution does not affect me. So you need to have this progression of offspring in order to get natural selection to work. So yeah, the implications of that are we do need tons and tons of startups, and we need a lot of them to die in order to make any progress. So. And you're right, Twitter basically killed all the other ones for the most part. So